Victoria expected the divorce to hurt. What she didn't expect was watching her best friend smile while she signed the papers. Rachel sat beside Lawrence, like she'd already replaced her. The lawyer slid the final document across the table. Victoria signed, 9 years gone. She stood to leave. Then the lawyer suddenly said, "Wait." Years later, Victoria still remembered the look on his face, because within minutes, everything Rachel thought she'd won would begin disappearing. And to understand why, you have to go back to the moment Victoria first noticed something she couldn't explain. Welcome to Mr. Graham's story, my beautiful, amazing family. Y'all have been so supportive, and I promise to always do my best to give you the best as I learn and improve every day. If this is your first time watching, comment below with where you're watching from, and subscribe to officially join the family. Looking back, Victoria couldn't remember what Rachel's joke was. She remembered the laugh. She remembered the smell of charcoal. She remembered one of the neighbor's kids running through the backyard with a popsicle melting down his arm. But mostly, she remembered the look. At the time, it seemed too small to matter. A fraction of a second, the kind of thing most people would never notice. The kind of thing she spent the next year wishing she'd paid more attention to. It happened during a Saturday cookout at her house. The weather was perfect. The backyard was full. Neighbors sat around folding tables. Someone had a portable speaker playing old songs nobody admitted they still liked. The grill was smoking. The cooler was nearly empty. Normal. Completely normal. Victoria was carrying a tray of drinks toward the patio when Rachel raised her voice from across the yard. "Lawrence, those burgers look dangerous." Lawrence glanced up from the grill. "They're fine. They're black. They're seasoned." Rachel laughed. "So, we're calling fire damage seasoning now?" A few people nearby laughed. Even Lawrence shook his head. "You don't know good food. I know a firefighter when I see one." More laughter. Nothing unusual. Nothing memorable. Then it happened. Lawrence looked at Rachel. Rachel looked back. And for a split second, something passed between them. Not flirtation. Not exactly. It was familiarity. Comfort. The kind shared by people who already knew the next line in the conversation. The kind of look that made Victoria pause without understanding why. Then, it was gone. The moment disappeared as quickly as it arrived. Rachel reached for her drink. Lawrence turned back to the grill. The party continued. Nobody noticed. At least, nobody else seemed to. Victoria stood there for another second before continuing toward the table. By the time she sat down, she felt silly for even thinking about it. Rachel was her best friend. Had been for over a decade. She'd stood beside her at her wedding, helped her through the worst moments of her life. When Victoria's mother died unexpectedly, Rachel practically moved into the house for 2 weeks to make sure she wasn't alone. People didn't betray friendships like that. Not Rachel. And Lawrence? Lawrence wasn't perfect. Nobody was, but he was dependable, predictable. The kind of man who always remembered to lock the doors before bed and always forgot where things were in the refrigerator. 9 years of marriage had made him many things. Mysterious wasn't one of them. By sunset, the cookout was winding down. Guests were leaving. Children were being collected. Someone was looking for a missing set of keys. Victoria stood beside the driveway saying goodbye when Rachel hugged her. "Thanks for today." "Anytime." Rachel smiled, then climbed into her car. A few minutes later, Lawrence walked up carrying a trash bag. "Good day." Victoria nodded. "Yeah." They stood there watching the last car disappear down the street. Neither said anything. The evening felt peaceful, comfortable, exactly the kind of life Victoria thought she wanted. And maybe that was why she ignored the feeling that followed her inside later that night, because once everyone was gone, once the dishes were done, once the house became quiet again, she found herself thinking about that look, not obsessing over it, not analyzing it, just remembering it, trying to understand why it bothered her. She couldn't. Eventually she rolled her eyes at herself and went to bed. There was no mystery, no problem, no reason to think twice about it. At least, that's what she told herself. The truth was, that half-second moment never completely left her, and she would spend the next year convincing herself she had imagined it. For a while, nothing happened. At least nothing obvious. Life continued exactly the way it always had. Lawrence went to work. Rachel stopped by whenever she felt like it. Weekends came and went. The uncomfortable feeling from the cookout gradually faded into the background, or at least Victoria thought it had. The truth was, once she noticed that look, she started noticing other things. Not intentionally. She wasn't looking for problems. The observations simply started collecting themselves. A few weeks after the cookout, the three of them met for dinner at a restaurant downtown. The place was crowded. The hostess recognized them immediately. They'd been coming there for years. Halfway through the meal, Rachel started telling a story about a client from work. She got stuck, trying to remember a name. Before she could finish the sentence, Lawrence supplied it. Immediately. No hesitation. No thinking. The exact name. Rachel pointed at him. "That's it." Lawrence smiled. The conversation moved on. Nobody reacted. But Victoria found herself wondering something. When had Rachel told him that story? The thought appeared for a second and disappeared again. Not important. People talk. Friends share stories. Normal. A month later, another moment happened. Then another. Small things. Always small things. One Friday evening, Rachel arrived carrying takeout. She walked straight into the kitchen like she lived there. Nobody thought twice about it. She'd been doing that for years. As Victoria unpacked containers, Rachel glanced at Lawrence. "Did you ever fix it?" Lawrence groaned. "No." Rachel laughed. "I knew it." Victoria looked up. "Fix what?" For a brief moment, both of them looked at her. Then Lawrence answered, "The sink." At exactly the same moment, Rachel said, "The sink." Everyone laughed, including Victoria, but something about the exchange lingered, not because of what they said, because of how quickly they said it, like they'd already had the conversation before. Later that night, Victoria caught herself replaying it, then immediately felt ridiculous. What was she supposed to be suspicious of? A sink? She shook her head and let it go. A few days later, she met Rachel for coffee. They sat near the window of their favorite cafe, talking about work, family, and the usual things people who've known each other for years talk about. At one point, Rachel mentioned a new seafood restaurant opening across town. Then she laughed. Lawrence would hate that place. Victoria looked up. "Why?" Rachel blinked. "The seafood." "What about it?" "He hates seafood." The answer came naturally, too naturally. Victoria stirred her coffee. "Since when do you know that?" Rachel froze for half a second. Not long, but long enough. Then she laughed. "Oh, come on. I've known him forever." The explanation made sense. Perfect sense. Yet Victoria found herself staring out the window afterward, because she couldn't remember Lawrence ever discussing seafood with Rachel. Maybe he had. Probably he had. Still, the thought stayed. Months passed. The moments kept coming. Always small. Never enough. One evening, Rachel showed up unexpectedly, while Lawrence was still at work. The two women spent an hour talking in the living room. Then, Rachel glanced at her phone. He should be getting home soon. Victoria looked up. "Who?" Rachel immediately looked annoyed with herself, then smiled. "Lawrence." A strange silence followed. Rachel quickly stood. "Anyway, I should probably head out." The moment disappeared almost instantly. But Victoria noticed it, not because Rachel knew Lawrence's schedule, because she knew it down to the minute. That night, Victoria lay awake longer than usual. Beside her, Lawrence was already asleep. The room was dark. The ceiling fan hummed softly overhead, and for the first time, she allowed herself to ask a question she didn't like, not because she believed it, because she couldn't stop wondering, what if something is going on? The thought made her uncomfortable immediately. She rolled onto her side, closed her eyes, forced herself to think about something else. Rachel was her best friend. Lawrence was her husband. People didn't spend over a decade building trust just to destroy it, especially not people like them. The next morning, she felt embarrassed she had even thought it, and from that day forward, she made a decision. Whenever something felt strange, she would assume the best. Whenever a question appeared, she would let it go. Whenever doubts surfaced, she would trust them. It seemed like the right thing to do, the healthy thing to do. What Victoria didn't realize was that trust and denial can sometimes look almost identical from the inside, and over the next several months, that difference would become harder and harder to ignore, because the moments weren't stopping. They were becoming patterns. The strange thing was that nothing ever happened, at least not in a way Victoria could point to. There was never a message that appeared at the wrong time, never a suspicious phone call, never an obvious mistake. If there had been, everything might have ended sooner. Instead, she lived inside uncertainty, and uncertainty has a way of making people doubt themselves. By winter, Victoria had become very good at talking herself out of things. Too good. One Tuesday evening, Lawrence texted around 4:30, running late. Meeting went long. Victoria looked at the message and set her phone down. Nothing unusual. Work had been busy lately. She canceled their dinner reservation and ordered takeout instead. The evening passed quietly. The next afternoon, she met Rachel for coffee. Halfway through the conversation, Rachel laughed about something, then casually said, "At least Lawrence survived yesterday." Victoria frowned. Survived what? The smile disappeared from Rachel's face, only for a second, but Victoria saw it. The meeting. What meeting? Rachel blinked. Oh. A pause, then another. I think he mentioned work was crazy. Victoria watched her. Rachel immediately took a sip of coffee. The conversation moved on, but something about the exchange stayed behind. Because Rachel's first answer had sounded certain, the second answer sounded invented. When Victoria got home that evening, she considered asking Lawrence about it. The thought lasted maybe 30 seconds. Then she abandoned it. What was she supposed to say? My best friend accidentally mentioned your meeting? The entire thing sounded ridiculous, so she said nothing. Weeks passed. Then another moment arrived. A small one, the kind that shouldn't have mattered. The three of them attended a neighborhood fundraiser. Nothing fancy. A local charity event held at a community center. By the end of the evening, people were gathering coats and saying goodbye. Lawrence stepped outside to take a phone call. Victoria stayed inside, helping stack chairs. Rachel walked over. You okay? Victoria smiled. Why wouldn't I be? You seem tired. I am tired. Rachel nodded, then glanced toward the entrance, toward where Lawrence had gone. The glance lasted barely a second, but there was something in it. Concern, not friendly concern, something more personal, more invested. When Rachel noticed Victoria watching her, she immediately looked away. The moment vanished, but Victoria didn't forget it. That night, she stood in the bathroom brushing her teeth beside Lawrence, the same routine they'd followed for years. Neither said much. The day had been long. Lawrence finished first. He kissed the top of her head, then headed toward the bedroom. Victoria remained at the sink, staring at her reflection. The question returned, stronger this time. What if I'm not imagining it? She hated the thought, hated it immediately, because if she followed it to its conclusion, everything changed. Not only her marriage, her friendship, her history, her entire understanding of the people closest to her. Most people think denial is about refusing to see something. Victoria would later realize that's not always true. Sometimes denial is seeing something and deciding you don't want it to be true. So she chose trust. Again, and again, and again. The pattern continued into spring. By then, Victoria had developed a habit she never admitted to anyone. She watched, not obsessively, not constantly, but she paid attention, more than she used to. She noticed how quickly Lawrence answered Rachel's messages, how often Rachel seemed to know his schedule, how naturally they moved around each other. Every observation felt harmless by itself. Together they formed a picture she refused to look at directly. Then came the moment she almost asked a question she couldn't take back. Rachel had stopped by one Saturday afternoon. The three of them were standing in the kitchen. Rachel was telling a story. Lawrence interrupted. Rachel laughed, and without thinking, she touched his arm. A quick gesture, completely natural, the kind of thing friends do, but neither of them pulled away. Neither seemed to notice it at all. Victoria did. For a second, the room felt strangely quiet. Rachel eventually removed her hand. The conversation continued. Nobody acknowledged it. Victoria almost spoke. Almost. Then she didn't. Because once a question leaves your mouth, you can't pretend it never existed. That evening, after Rachel left, Victoria sat alone on the back patio. The sun was setting behind the trees. The neighborhood was quiet. Somewhere down the street, a dog barked. Inside the house, she could hear Lawrence watching television. A normal evening. A normal life. The kind of life she desperately wanted to believe was still intact. And that's when she made a choice. She would stop looking, stop noticing, stop questioning, because every time she followed the feeling, it led somewhere she didn't want to go. Trust was easier. Trust was safer. Trust allowed tomorrow to look like today. What she didn't know was that the truth had already become too large to stay hidden forever. Neither Rachel nor Lawrence realized it either, because after 4 years of secrecy, both of them had become comfortable, careless, and eventually, even careful people make mistakes. The mistake that ended. Everything happened on a rainy Thursday afternoon. Lawrence forgot his tablet at home, and by sunset, Victoria would know the truth. The truth arrived on a Thursday, a rainy Thursday, the kind of day where the sky never fully brightens, no matter what time it is. Victoria had been working from home all morning. Emails, paperwork, phone calls, nothing unusual. Around 2 o'clock, she remembered a document she needed to print. Normally, she would have used her laptop, except the printer wasn't cooperating. Again, Lawrence's tablet, however, was already connected. He'd left it on the kitchen counter before heading to work. Victoria picked it up without a second thought. If someone had told her that a 5-second decision was about to change her entire life, she would have laughed. The screen lit up. She opened the file she needed. Then, a notification appeared. Rachel. Victoria barely glanced at it. At first, then she saw the preview. Miss you already. Her fingers stopped moving. The words sat there for a second before disappearing. Victoria stared at the screen, not because the message was shocking, because it was strange. Strange enough to make her pause. Her mind immediately started building explanations. Maybe they had lunch. Maybe Rachel was talking about something work-related. Maybe. The notification vanished. Victoria set the tablet down, walked to the sink, filled a glass with water. She was halfway through a sip when the second notification appeared. A soft chime, nothing more, but the sound seemed unusually loud. Victoria looked and saw. Last night was worth the risk. The glass froze halfway to her mouth. The words didn't need interpretation, didn't need context, didn't need explanation. Her stomach dropped, not dramatically, not the way people describe things afterward. It felt more like the floor beneath her had shifted slightly, enough to throw off her balance. Victoria set the glass down. Water splashed across the counter. She didn't notice. The rain tapped steadily against the kitchen windows. The refrigerator hummed. A car passed outside. Normal sounds. A normal afternoon. Except nothing felt normal anymore. She looked at the message again. Then again. The same words. The same names. Rachel. Lawrence. Last night. Worth the risk. And suddenly, memories began arriving. Not answers. Memories. The cookout. The glances. The private jokes. The coffee conversation. The scheduled comments. The strange familiarity. Every moment she'd spent a year explaining away started lining up beside each other. For the first time, they pointed in the same direction. Victoria lowered herself into a kitchen chair. Slowly, carefully, like standing too quickly might somehow make everything real. Part of her wanted to lock the tablet and walk away, not because she believed nothing had happened, because as long as she didn't look, there was still room for doubt. A tiny space where her marriage remained intact. A tiny space where Rachel was still Rachel. A tiny space where her life made sense. She stared at the screen, then closed her eyes. For a few seconds, she sat perfectly still. The rain continued. The house remained quiet. And somewhere deep down, Victoria already knew what she was about to find. The only question left was how bad it really was. So she picked up the tablet, opened the message thread, and stepped into a version of her life she never knew existed. The first thing Victoria saw wasn't a message. It was a photograph. Rachel was sitting on a hotel balcony. The sun was setting behind her. She was laughing, not posing for the camera, laughing at whoever was holding it. Victoria looked at the date. 2 years earlier. Her chest tightened. She scrolled. Another photo. Then another. A restaurant. A weekend trip. A conference Lawrence had supposedly attended alone. The farther she went, the worse it became. At first, she was looking for context, an explanation, anything that would make the messages mean something else. Instead, She found evidence, years of it. There were good morning texts, good night texts, inside jokes, vacation plans, pictures, voice messages, arguments, apologies, entire conversations stretching across months. Not an affair, a relationship, a complete relationship. Victoria sat motionless, her eyes moving across the screen, her brain struggling to keep up. The timestamps kept going backward, month after month, year after year. Then she found it, the beginning, almost 4 years earlier. 4 years. The number landed heavily. 4 years meant anniversaries, family dinners, birthdays, weekend trips, Christmas mornings. 4 years meant that nearly half her marriage had existed alongside something else, something hidden, something neither of them had ever intended for her to see. Victoria leaned back in the chair. The rain outside had gotten heavier. Water streaked down the windows. The kitchen seemed darker now. Or maybe she simply hadn't noticed the daylight fading. She kept reading, not because she wanted to, because she couldn't stop. Every message answered a question she never wanted answered. Then she found something that hurt more than the photos, more than the hotel reservations, more than the lies. An argument, a real one. Rachel was angry. The messages stretched over several days. Victoria scrolled slowly, and then she read the sentence. "You always choose her when things get complicated." Victoria froze. The words sat on the screen, simple, direct, painfully revealing, because suddenly she understood something. Rachel didn't see herself as the other woman. Rachel saw herself as the woman waiting for her turn. Victoria kept reading. "I'm tired of feeling like a secret." Another message. "You keep promising things will change." Then, Lawrence's response, "Just give me time." Victoria stared at the screen. The room felt very quiet. For years, she had thought Rachel was standing beside her, supporting her, protecting their friendship. Meanwhile, Rachel had been complaining about her existence, talking about her like she was an obstacle, a problem, something standing in the way of the life she wanted. Victoria looked away from the tablet, toward the empty dining room, the empty hallway, the house she'd spent years making into a home. Then she looked back. And somehow it got worse, because now she started seeing herself inside their conversations. Not directly, but often enough. Rachel asking if Lawrence had told her something. Lawrence mentioning plans he had with Victoria. Rachel becoming frustrated whenever Victoria needed attention, especially after her mother's death. One message stopped her completely. It had been sent years earlier, only a few weeks after the funeral. Rachel had written, "I know she needs you right now." The next message followed immediately. "I just miss having you to myself." Victoria stared at the words. For a long time, the rain hit the windows harder. Somewhere in the house, the refrigerator compressor switched off. The silence that followed felt enormous, because she remembered that time. She remembered grieving, remembered struggling to get through ordinary days, remembered Rachel bringing food, checking in, offering support, standing beside her. At least that's what she thought Rachel was doing. Now those memories felt different. Not false, different, as if she'd been reading only half the story. Hours passed. Victoria barely noticed. The messages kept revealing more lies, more plans, more promises, more evidence that the two people she trusted most had built an entire life behind her back. And then she found the message that finally made her stop scrolling. It came from Rachel. A simple question, sent nearly a year earlier. "Do you think she'll ever find out?" Victoria's eyes moved to Lawrence's response. One word, no. Nothing else. No hesitation, no concern, no guilt, just certainty. No. Victoria stared at that word for a long time. Then she set the tablet down. For the first time all afternoon, she wasn't thinking about Rachel, or Lawrence, or even the affair. She was thinking about herself, about how many rooms she'd walked into smiling, how many dinners she'd attended, how many conversations she'd had, while the two people sitting beside her shared a secret she knew nothing about. That thought hurt, in a way she hadn't expected. By the time the garage door finally opened that evening, Victoria was still sitting at the kitchen table. The tablet rested in front of her. The screen had gone dark, but the truth hadn't. And the moment she heard Lawrence step inside the house, she realized something. The marriage was already over. He just didn't know it yet. The garage door opened at 6:17. Victoria noticed the time immediately, not because she was watching the clock, because she'd been sitting at the kitchen table for almost 3 hours. The tablet remained in front of her. The screen had gone dark. The messages were still there. So was everything they had destroyed. A moment later, the front door opened. Lawrence stepped inside, the same way he always did. Keys into the bowl, jacket over the chair, a tired exhale. Routine, predictable, normal. For a few seconds, Victoria watched him move through a life that no longer existed. Then he saw the tablet. Everything changed. Not dramatically, not in a movie scene kind of way. His shoulders tightened. His eyes locked onto the device. The color drained from his face. And in that moment, Victoria knew something she hadn't known all afternoon. He had never planned to tell her. Not tomorrow, not next year, not ever. Victoria. That was all he said. Her name, nothing else. No explanation, no denial, no confusion, just her name. Because he already knew. She knew, and there was nothing left to hide. Victoria looked at him. How long? Lawrence closed his eyes. A tiny reaction, but it told her everything. Still, she waited. Victoria. How long? The second time, her voice sounded calmer. That somehow made the room feel colder. Lawrence looked toward the floor, then toward the window, anywhere except at her. Finally, he answered, about 4 years. The number landed exactly the way it had earlier. Heavy, certain, real. Victoria let out a short laugh. Not because anything was funny, because her brain didn't know what else to do with something so absurd. 4 years. Rachel. 4 years. The woman who stood beside her at her wedding. The woman who brought food after her mother died. The woman she'd trusted with every major chapter of her adult life. 4 years. Neither spoke. Rain tapped softly against the windows. The kitchen clock continued ticking. Ordinary sounds. An ordinary evening. Nothing about it felt ordinary anymore. Eventually, Lawrence sat down across from her, slowly, like he was approaching a wounded animal. I never wanted you to find out like this. Victoria stared at him. The sentence floated between them, meaningless, not cruel, not helpful, just meaningless, because there was no good way to discover 4 years of betrayal. Lawrence rubbed his hands together. I didn't mean for it to happen. There it was, the sentence, the one Victoria would remember long after everything else faded. Not because it was shocking, because it was ridiculous. She looked at him for a long moment, then shook her head. You didn't mean for 4 years to happen. Lawrence looked away. The silence answered for him. For the first time all afternoon, Victoria felt anger. Not explosive anger. Not shouting. Something quieter. The kind that settles in your chest and refuses to leave. Because 4 years wasn't an accident. 4 years required planning, choices, conversations, lies, thousands of them, every holiday, every anniversary, every family gathering, every time Rachel sat at their table, every time Lawrence kissed her goodbye before work, every single one was a choice. Victoria pushed the tablet toward him. You know what I can't stop thinking about? Lawrence said nothing. She continued. All the energy you both spent protecting this. Another silence. Then she added, you could have put that energy into being honest. The words landed. Lawrence flinched slightly, not dramatically, just enough. Victoria stood. The conversation was over, not because everything had been said, because nothing useful remained. She walked upstairs, opened the closet, pulled out a suitcase. For a few minutes, the only sounds were hangers sliding across metal rods and drawers opening and closing. Lawrence appeared in the doorway, once, then disappeared again, as if he couldn't decide whether to help or stop her. Eventually, he settled on doing neither. Victoria packed clothes, toiletries, a few personal items, nothing sentimental, no photographs, no keepsakes, no attempts to preserve the life she was leaving behind. 20 minutes later, she carried the suitcase downstairs. Lawrence was standing in the living room, waiting, the same way people wait for storms to pass. Hoping, uncertain, afraid. Victoria reached the front door, then paused, not because she was reconsidering, because there was one thing she wanted to know. She turned around. "Does Rachel love you?" Lawrence looked surprised. The question clearly wasn't what he expected. After a moment, he nodded. "I think she does." Victoria absorbed that, then asked the second question. "Do you love her?" This time, the silence lasted longer, long enough to become an answer before words arrived. Eventually, Lawrence nodded. "Yes." The honesty should have hurt. Instead, it felt clarifying, like the final piece of a puzzle she never wanted to complete. Victoria looked at him for another second, then opened the door. Cool air rushed inside. Rain still fell steadily beyond the porch light. She stepped outside. No dramatic goodbye, no speech, no screaming, nothing left to prove. The door closed behind her, and with it, 9 years of marriage. As Victoria walked toward her car, she didn't know what the future looked like. She didn't know about the divorce, the trust, the lawyer, the company, none of it. All she knew was that she could no longer stay inside a life built on lies. Behind her, Lawrence remained standing in the house. Ahead of her, the road disappeared into the rain, and somewhere far down that road, consequences were already beginning to move toward all three of them. For the first few weeks after Victoria left, there was still uncertainty. People knew something had happened. They didn't know exactly what. Glenview was a small town, but even small towns need time to assemble a story. At first, the rumors moved slowly. Then, Lawrence and Rachel stopped hiding, and suddenly nobody had to guess anymore. The first person to tell Victoria was Melissa, one of the few friends who never disappeared. They were sitting in a coffee shop downtown when Melissa set her cup down carefully, the way people do when they're about to say something uncomfortable. "I saw them." Victoria already knew who she meant. "Together?" Melissa nodded. "Dinner." Victoria stirred her coffee. "Okay." Melissa watched her. "You don't have to pretend that doesn't bother you." Victoria gave a small smile. "I'm not pretending." The truth was more complicated. Of course it bothered her. But by then, the betrayal itself wasn't the surprise anymore. The surprise was how quickly Rachel seemed willing to step into Victoria's place. A week later, Victoria saw it herself. She was leaving a grocery store when she spotted them across the parking lot. Rachel was laughing. Lawrence was carrying shopping bags. The two of them looked comfortable, familiar, like a couple. For a second, Victoria froze. Not because she wanted Lawrence back, not because she missed Rachel, because seeing something and imagining something are two different experiences. One lives in your head, the other stands 20 feet away, pushing a grocery cart. Lawrence noticed her first. His smile vanished immediately. Rachel turned. Their eyes met, and then something happened that Victoria never forgot. Rachel smiled, not warmly, not awkwardly, confidently, like someone who believed she had won. The expression lasted only a second. Then Rachel looked away, but it was enough. Victoria continued walking. She didn't wave, didn't stop, didn't acknowledge either of them. By the time she reached her car, her hands were shaking slightly, not from sadness, from anger, not because Rachel was with Lawrence, because Rachel looked proud of it. That was the first moment Victoria realized something important. Rachel wasn't carrying guilt. Rachel believed she was the main character in a love story, and Victoria was simply the obstacle that had finally been removed. The realization followed her home. Over the next few months, Lawrence and Rachel became increasingly public. Restaurants, fundraisers, community events, places Lawrence used to attend with Victoria. Now Rachel sat beside him, and every appearance created another round of conversations. The town noticed. Of course they noticed. People always do, especially when betrayal involves familiar faces. Some people were kind, others weren't. A few neighbors avoided eye contact altogether, like her divorce was contagious. Those reactions surprised Victoria more than she expected, not because people were cruel, because they were uncomfortable. Discomfort makes people behave strangely. Some friends checked on her regularly, others disappeared. A few tried to stay neutral. Those were the hardest. "I don't want to take sides." Victoria heard that sentence more times than she could count. Every time, it landed the same way. Because there are situations where neutrality sounds reasonable. This wasn't one of them. One evening, She ran into an old acquaintance at a community event. The woman smiled nervously. Well, relationships are complicated. Victoria looked at her. No. The woman blinked. No? Victoria shook her head. Some things are complicated. Then she walked away, because she was tired of people treating betrayal like a misunderstanding. Meanwhile, Rachel seemed increasingly comfortable and increasingly visible. The confidence grew. The comments became bolder. The smiles lasted longer. The woman who used to enter Victoria's home through the front door now acted as if she'd inherited the entire life. At least, that's what she wanted people to believe. What Rachel couldn't see was that the performance looked very different from the outside. Most people weren't impressed. Most people weren't jealous. Most people were simply watching. And the more Rachel celebrated her victory, the more uncomfortable it made everyone around her, including Lawrence. Victoria didn't realize it yet, but the relationship Rachel had fought so hard to win was already beginning to change. Because affairs survive on secrecy, on excitement, on stolen moments. Real life is different. Real life shows up every morning. And eventually, reality was going to ask both of them a very expensive question, one they weren't prepared to answer. 3 months after Victoria left the house, Lawrence officially filed for divorce. The paperwork arrived on a Tuesday. Victoria wasn't surprised. The marriage had ended the night she walked out. The legal process was simply catching up. She signed what needed signing, forwarded documents to her attorney, answered questions, then went back to work. The practical side of divorce turned out to be strangely exhausting. Not emotionally, administratively, forms, deadlines, appointments, conversations nobody wants to have, life becoming paperwork. A few weeks later, Melissa called again. This time she didn't bother with small talk. Rachel moved in. Victoria closed her eyes, not because she was shocked, because she knew exactly what that meant. Are you sure? Everybody knows. That was Glenview. There were no secrets, only information moving at different speeds. Victoria thanked her, hung up, then sat quietly for a minute. The image appeared immediately. Rachel, walking through the house, opening cabinets, rearranging rooms, sleeping in the bedroom, living inside a life she had helped destroy. Victoria hated that her mind went there. She hated it even more because she couldn't stop it. For the next few days, the thought kept resurfacing. Eventually, she forced herself to let it go. There was no benefit in imagining it. No answers, no healing, only pain. Meanwhile, the town was having its own reaction. The affair had been one thing. Rachel, moving into the house before the divorce was finalized, felt different. Even people who had tried to stay neutral began struggling with it. One afternoon, Victoria was having lunch with Melissa when a familiar woman approached their table, someone they'd both known for years. She hesitated, then leaned closer. I just wanted to say. The woman paused, searching for the right words. I'm sorry. Victoria looked up. The woman continued. What they did wasn't right. Then she walked away. The entire exchange lasted less than 30 seconds, but it stayed with Victoria because it was one of the first times someone stopped pretending the situation was complicated. It wasn't, and deep down, most people knew it. Rachel, however, seemed increasingly convinced she had won something. Stories traveled. Comments reached Victoria, not directly. Glenview always had messengers. Apparently Rachel had begun attending events with Lawrence as though she'd always belonged beside him. She talked about future plans, future vacations, future renovations to the house, future investments, always future, as if the past had already been erased. One afternoon, Victoria attended a charity luncheon she'd almost skipped. She was standing near a display table when she heard a familiar voice. Rachel. Victoria turned. Their eyes met across the room. Rachel smiled. The same smile from the grocery store. Confident, satisfied, almost triumphant. This time Victoria didn't look away. She held the eye contact for a moment, long enough to notice something she'd missed before. Rachel wasn't happy, not truly. Happy people don't work that hard to look victorious. Then Rachel walked away. The moment ended, but the observation stayed, because for the first time, Victoria stopped seeing Rachel as someone who had taken something from her. She started seeing her as someone desperately trying to prove she deserved it. The distinction mattered. At the same time, something else was happening. Something Rachel wasn't paying attention to. Victoria's life was slowly expanding, not dramatically, not overnight. One decision at a time. She accepted invitations she'd previously declined, started attending more business meetings, became more involved in conversations she'd once left entirely to Lawrence. At first it felt strange, almost uncomfortable. For years, she had allowed him to handle most company matters, not because she wasn't capable, because she trusted him. Now that trust was gone, and unexpectedly, so was the reason she'd stayed in the background. One afternoon, after a board meeting, an older executive stopped her in the hallway. "Have you ever considered taking a larger role?" Victoria laughed. "Not seriously. You should." The comment caught her off guard. The executive shrugged. "I'm serious." Then, he walked away. The conversation lasted maybe 15 seconds, but it planted a seed, a small one. At the time, Victoria didn't realize how important it would become, because while Rachel was focused on stepping into Victoria's old life, Victoria was beginning to build a new one. Neither woman understood it yet, but they were moving in completely different directions, and very soon, those paths were about to cross one final time, inside a conference room, around a divorce table, with a lawyer holding documents nobody had bothered to read carefully. The conference room felt smaller than Victoria expected. Maybe it was the low ceiling. Maybe it was the fact that everyone sitting around the table already knew how the story ended, or thought they did. She arrived 10 minutes early, not because she was eager to be there, because she wanted a few minutes without anyone else in the room. The lawyer was organizing paperwork when she walked in. Stacks of documents, folders, financial reports, everything neatly arranged. The paper version of a failed marriage. Victoria took a seat, accepted a bottle of water, waited. A few minutes later, the door opened. Lawrence walked in. Rachel followed him. Victoria blinked. That part she hadn't expected. Rachel wasn't involved in the divorce. Legally speaking, she had no reason to be there. Yet she pulled out a chair and sat beside Lawrence as though she belonged at the table. Nobody challenged it. The lawyer looked uncomfortable. Lawrence looked tired. Rachel looked confident. The meeting began. Property discussions, account summaries, investment reviews, legal language, numbers, dates, details. Victoria listened, answered questions when necessary, signed preliminary documents. Mostly, she felt detached, not numb, finished. The emotional battle had happened months earlier. This was administration, nothing more. About halfway through the meeting, the lawyer paused to locate another document. The brief silence gave Rachel an opportunity, and unfortunately, she took it. "You know," Rachel said casually, "this is probably better for everyone." Nobody responded. The lawyer continued shuffling papers. Lawrence stared straight ahead. Rachel leaned back in her chair, comfortable, relaxed, as if she were discussing the weather. Sometimes people stay in relationships because they're comfortable. The room grew noticeably quieter. Victoria looked at her. Rachel smiled, not kindly, not nervously, confidently. Lawrence deserves to be happy. The statement hung there, heavy, awkward. Nobody seemed interested in helping it land. The lawyer suddenly became fascinated with a folder. Lawrence shifted in his chair, but he didn't correct her, didn't stop her, didn't say anything at all. And somehow that silence revealed more than any words could have. Victoria looked away first, not because Rachel had hurt her feelings, because the conversation felt beneath her. Months earlier, she might have responded. Months earlier, she might have argued. Now she simply wanted the meeting finished. Eventually, the lawyer found the document he needed. The discussion resumed. More paperwork, more signatures, more reminders that entire lives can be reduced to legal language. Then, finally, the last document appeared. The lawyer slid it across the table. "This is the final agreement." Nobody spoke. The moment had arrived. Victoria looked down at the paperwork. 9 years, represented by a signature line. She picked up the pen, signed her name, placed the pen back on the table. Done. Across from her, Lawrence exhaled slowly. Relief. Rachel smiled. Satisfaction. The lawyer gathered the papers. The meeting was over. At least everyone believed it was. Victoria stood, smoothed her jacket. "Take care." A simple goodbye. Nothing dramatic. No final speech. No emotional scene. Rachel looked oddly disappointed, as though she'd expected tears, or anger, or some kind of victory speech. Instead, she got acceptance. Victoria turned toward the door. Her hand touched the handle. Then she heard a voice behind her. "Wait." The lawyer. Something about his tone felt wrong immediately. Victoria stopped, turned around. The lawyer wasn't looking at her. He was staring at a document, one she'd already signed. His forehead was creased, his expression tense, confused. He flipped to another page, then another, then back again. Lawrence frowned. "What is it?" No answer. The lawyer kept reading. Rachel shifted in her seat. "What's going on?" Still nothing. The room grew quiet, the kind of quiet people fall into when they realize something unexpected is happening. Finally, the lawyer looked up, and for the first time all afternoon, he looked genuinely alarmed. Not concerned, not confused. Alarmed. His face had gone pale. Actually pale. He swallowed, looked toward Victoria, then toward Lawrence, and said 4 words that instantly changed the atmosphere in the room. "There's a trust provision." Nobody moved. Nobody understood what he meant. Not yet. But everyone suddenly knew one thing. The divorce wasn't over, and whatever the lawyer had just found, it was important enough to make him forget how to hide his reaction. For several seconds, nobody spoke. The lawyer continued staring at the document. Then he looked at it again, as if hoping he'd made a mistake. Victoria slowly stepped away from the door. Lawrence frowned. What trust provision? The lawyer rubbed his forehead. The reaction alone was unsettling. Attorneys weren't supposed to look surprised by paperwork. Paperwork was their entire job. Yet this man looked like he'd just discovered a problem nobody expected, including him. He opened another folder, compared documents, checked dates, read the same paragraph twice, then finally took a slow breath. "Victoria, your grandfather established a family trust before he passed away." Victoria nodded. "I know." Most of Glenview knew. Her grandfather had been successful. The trust had existed for years. There was nothing unusual about that. At least, that's what she thought. The lawyer nodded. "I know you know about the trust." He tapped the document. "What I don't think anyone understood was how much of your family's holdings remained under trust protection." Lawrence laughed, a short, irritated laugh, the kind people make when they're already frustrated. "What does that have to do with us?" The lawyer looked at him. Everything. The answer was obvious from his face, but he still seemed reluctant to say it out loud. Rachel crossed her arms. "Can someone explain what's happening?" The lawyer flipped the document around. "There is a spousal access clause." Nobody spoke. "A what?" Lawrence asked. "A spousal access clause." The lawyer pointed to a paragraph. "This trust grants operational access to protected assets while the marriage remains legally active." Victoria frowned. The sentence sounded important. She wasn't sure why. Neither was anyone else. Lawrence leaned forward. "So?" The lawyer swallowed, then delivered the sentence that changed the room. "The divorce became effective 23 minutes ago." Silence. Rachel looked confused. Lawrence looked annoyed. Victoria looked between them, still waiting for someone to explain why that mattered. The lawyer continued, "And the moment the divorce became effective, all spousal access provisions automatically terminated." Nobody reacted, not because they understood, because they didn't. The words made sense. The consequences didn't. Finally, Lawrence shook his head. "What access?" The lawyer closed the folder. "The company." The room froze. "The company?" Lawrence repeated. "The company." Rachel blinked. "What company?" The lawyer looked directly at her. "Glenview Development Holdings." For the first time, Rachel's confidence slipped. Only slightly, but Victoria noticed it. Lawrence sat straighter. "This is ridiculous." The lawyer didn't argue. Instead, he reached for another file, a much older one. "The company remained under trust ownership." Lawrence stared at him. "No." The answer came instantly, automatic, almost defensive. "No, it didn't." The lawyer slid the document across the table. Read it. Lawrence grabbed it. His eyes moved quickly, then more slowly, then slower still. Victoria watched the change happen in real time. The confidence disappeared first, then the irritation, then something else, something closer to fear. Rachel leaned toward him. What does it say? Lawrence didn't answer. The lawyer did. It says the trust never transferred ownership. The room became painfully quiet. Victoria sat back in her chair, because suddenly she was confused too. She knew her grandfather's trust existed. She knew the company had family connections, but she'd spent years letting Lawrence handle the details, years assuming he understood things. She didn't. Apparently that assumption had been shared by everyone, including Lawrence. The lawyer continued. The ownership structure remained unchanged. Nobody interrupted. Nobody wanted to. The trust controls the company. Another silence. Then came the sentence Victoria would remember for the rest of her life. The sentence that made Rachel stop smiling. The sentence that made Lawrence stop breathing for a moment. The sentence that explained why the lawyer had gone pale. You didn't own Glenview Development Holdings, Lawrence. The lawyer's voice remained calm. You managed it. Nobody moved. Nobody spoke. The lawyer continued. You were authorized to operate it because you were Victoria's spouse. Lawrence stared at him, then at the paperwork, then back at the lawyer. No. Again, the same word, only weaker this time. The lawyer opened another file, one after another. Decades of documentation, signatures, amendments, trust provisions, ownership structures, every page pointing to the same conclusion. The company, the estate, the investment holdings, the mansion, the vehicles, the protected accounts, none of it belonged to Lawrence. His access existed because of the marriage, and the marriage had ended less than half an hour ago. Rachel slowly leaned back in her chair. For the first time since arriving, she looked nervous. Actually nervous. Victoria sat motionless, trying to process her own role in all of this. Because the strangest part wasn't Lawrence's reaction. It was realizing she hadn't known either, not fully. The lawyer closed the final folder. The sound echoed softly across the room. Then he looked at Lawrence, not unkindly, just honestly. I think you need to call your attorney. And for the first time all afternoon, nobody looked like they had won anything. The first 24 hours felt like a misunderstanding, at least to Lawrence. He spent most of them convincing himself that someone had made a mistake. There had to be an error. A missing document, a technicality, something, because the alternative made no sense. By the next morning, he had already called 2 attorneys. By lunch, he'd called 3 more. Each conversation followed the same pattern. Explanation, review, silence. Then, bad news. The trust documents were valid. The ownership structure was valid. The provisions were enforceable. Nothing appeared incorrect. Nothing appeared accidental. The paperwork was exactly what the lawyer said it was, and the more professionals reviewed it, the worse the situation looked. Meanwhile, Victoria was still trying to understand her own role in all of it. Her phone seemed to ring constantly. Trust administrators, financial advisors, attorneys, board members, people she had barely spoken to in years. Everyone suddenly wanted meetings. Everyone suddenly wanted decisions. One conversation in particular stayed with her. It came from a board member named Harold Bennett, the same man who had known her grandfather, the same man who had watched the company grow for decades. Victoria, his voice sounded exhausted. I need to ask you something. What? A pause. How much of this did you know? Victoria stared out the window. Honestly, please. Almost none of it. Harold laughed softly, not because it was funny, because it explained a lot. That makes 2 of us. The comment lingered, because Victoria was beginning to realize something uncomfortable. The trust hadn't only fooled Lawrence, it had fooled almost everyone, including people who worked around it every day. The difference was that most people never needed to understand the details. Until now, Lawrence did, and now it was too late. The consequences began arriving one after another, fast, almost ruthlessly fast. The board held an emergency meeting. Lawrence was removed from executive authority pending review. Several days later, The review became permanent. His access credentials stopped working. His company accounts were suspended. His decision-making authority disappeared. People who had reported directly to him for years suddenly reported elsewhere. The transition wasn't emotional. That was what made it brutal. Nobody argued. Nobody celebrated. The company simply adjusted. Businesses move forward. They always do. Rachel struggled to understand that. She had spent years viewing Lawrence as the man who ran Glenview Development Holdings. Now she was learning there was a difference between running something and owning it, and that difference was becoming expensive. 3 days after the divorce meeting, a formal notice arrived at the house. Rachel found it first. She stood in the kitchen reading the document twice. Then a third time, Lawrence walked in carrying groceries. She handed him the paperwork. "What is this?" Lawrence read it. His expression tightened immediately. The trust was reclaiming the property. The mansion, 30 days. That was the deadline. 30 days to vacate. Rachel stared at him. "This is a joke." Lawrence didn't answer. "Tell me this is a joke." Still nothing, because he knew it wasn't. For several seconds neither spoke. The kitchen felt strangely quiet. Boxes hadn't appeared yet. Nothing had changed physically. The house still looked exactly the same. Yet somehow, it already felt different, temporary, like they were borrowing someone else's future. A week later, another reality arrived. One of Rachel's credit cards stopped working, not because she was broke, because several financial structures she assumed were permanent were being reviewed and restructured. The embarrassment happened in a restaurant. In front of people, the card declined. She tried again, declined. A third attempt, same result. The waitress remained polite. Rachel did not. By the time they reached the parking lot, she was furious. "This is unbelievable." Lawrence leaned against the car, exhausted. Everything seemed to exhaust him lately. "We'll figure it out." "You keep saying that." The words came out sharper than intended. Both of them knew it. Neither apologized. The silence afterwards said enough, because for the first time, Rachel wasn't looking at the future she imagined. She was looking at the future she actually had, and the two were becoming very different things. Meanwhile, Victoria was watching none of it, not because she couldn't, because she didn't want to. That surprised people. Melissa asked about it one afternoon. "You don't check on them at all?" Victoria shook her head. "No, not even out of curiosity." Victoria thought for a second, then smiled. "I already know how the story ends." Melissa laughed. "What does that mean?" Victoria looked down at her coffee. "It means they're living with each other now." The answer sounded simple, but Melissa immediately understood. Affairs survive in stolen moments. Secret messages, hidden dinners, excitement, fantasy. Now the fantasy had to pay bills, handle stress, solve problems, live together. And reality rarely feels as exciting as imagination. By the end of the month, moving trucks had arrived at the mansion. Boxes lined the driveway. Workers carried furniture through the front doors. Neighbors slowed their cars while passing, not because they were being cruel, because the sight was impossible to ignore. For years, Lawrence had looked untouchable, successful, confident, certain. Now people were watching that certainty disappear one box at a time. And somewhere in the middle of it all, Rachel was beginning to realize something she never expected. Winning someone isn't the same thing as winning their life. At first, Lawrence and Rachel tried to act like nothing had changed, publicly at least. They still attended events, still smiled for photographs, still talked about future plans whenever someone asked. From a distance, they looked fine. Maybe not as comfortable as before, but fine. The problem was that appearances only work for so long, especially when reality keeps showing up. The first major argument happened over something small. At least that's how it started. A dinner reservation, nothing more. Rachel wanted to keep plans they'd already made. Lawrence wanted to cancel. Money was tighter than either of them expected. What began as a simple disagreement followed them from the house to the restaurant parking lot. By the time they arrived, neither was speaking. Inside the restaurant, the tension got worse. A comment, a response, a sarcastic remark, the kind of fight couples have every day. Except this one wasn't really about dinner. It was about everything else. The trust, the company, the house, the future, the disappointment neither wanted to admit out loud. Eventually, Rachel pushed her chair back. "I don't even recognize you anymore." Several nearby tables fell silent. Lawrence stared at her. "What does that even mean?" "It means you used to have a plan." The words landed harder than Rachel intended, because both of them knew she wasn't talking about dinner. She was talking about the life she thought she was getting. The argument ended without resolution. Most arguments do, but the damage remained, and in a town like Glenview, private moments rarely stayed private for long. By the next afternoon, people were already talking about the scene, not maliciously, just the way communities talk, especially when the people involved spent years at the center of local attention. The arguments became more frequent after that. Small things, then larger things, then things that had nothing to do with the original conversation. One evening, Rachel complained about expenses. The next week, Lawrence criticized a purchase she'd made. Another week, they argued about where they were going to live, long term. Every conversation seemed to circle back to the same issue. Neither of them were living the future they imagined, and disappointment has a way of turning into resentment when it stays too long. Meanwhile, Victoria's life was moving in a completely different direction. The contrast became noticeable, not overnight. Gradually, the board began inviting her into more meetings. Executives sought her opinion. People who had barely spoken to her before now treated her as someone whose voice mattered. At first, she felt out of place. Every room seemed filled with people who understood more than she did. Every conversation felt like a reminder of how much she'd left to Lawrence over the years. But something unexpected happened. The more she showed up, the more comfortable she became. One afternoon, after a particularly long meeting, Harold Bennett stopped her outside the conference room. "You know something?" Victoria smiled. "What?" "You ask better questions than most executives." She laughed. "I don't think that's true." "It is." Harold shrugged. "Most people walk into a room trying to prove how much they know." He pointed toward the conference table. "You walk in trying to learn." The compliment stayed with her, because for the first time in years, she wasn't being defined by a marriage, or a betrayal, or a divorce. She was becoming something else, something entirely her own. Around the same time, Lawrence received another rejection. A business venture he'd been pursuing quietly fell apart. Investors weren't interested, not because of the scandal, because the proposal wasn't strong enough. Still, Lawrence took it personally. Everything felt personal lately. Every setback, every obstacle, every reminder that his life looked different now. One evening, he sat alone in a small rental house, reviewing financial projections. The room was quiet. Rachel had gone out hours earlier. The television played softly in the background. For a moment, he found himself thinking about Victoria, not because he wanted her back. At least that's what he told himself, because he suddenly realized how many problems she'd quietly solved over the years. Things he'd never noticed, things he'd taken for granted. The thought irritated him, then embarrassed him, then stayed with him. Across town, Victoria was attending another company event, another meeting, another opportunity. And for the first time since discovering the affair, she noticed something strange. She had gone almost an entire week without thinking about Rachel, or Lawrence. The realization caught her off guard, not because she was trying to forget them, because she wasn't. Life had simply become larger than the betrayal, larger than the pain, larger than the story that once consumed her. And that was when the real healing began, not when she stopped hurting, when she stopped measuring her life against theirs. Because while Rachel and Lawrence were still trying to understand what had gone wrong, Victoria was finally starting to understand what could go right. And very soon, the difference between those paths would become impossible for everyone in Glenview to ignore. The first time Victoria sat at the head of the conference table, she almost laughed, not because anything was funny, because she was convinced someone had made a mistake. The room was filled with people who had spent decades in business, executives, department heads, financial advisors, people who seemed to speak an entirely different language whenever reports appeared on a screen. And now they were looking at her, waiting, expecting her to lead the meeting. Victoria glanced down at her notes, then back up. "Okay." A few people smiled. The tension eased immediately. The meeting began. She stumbled through parts of it. Ask questions she worried sounded obvious. Requested explanations more experienced leaders might have already known. But something surprising happened. Nobody seemed bothered. In fact, several people appeared relieved. Because while Victoria didn't pretend to know everything, she paid attention. She listened. And after years of being managed by people who loved hearing themselves talk, employees found that refreshing. The confidence didn't arrive overnight. It arrived through repetition. Meeting after meeting. Decision after decision. Mistake after mistake. Because there were mistakes. Plenty of them. One project ran over budget. Another proposal failed completely. More than once, Victoria left work wondering if she was in over her head. But unlike before, she kept showing up. And that made all the difference. One afternoon, she visited a construction site outside Glenview. Workers were finishing the foundation of a new development project. Hard hats, heavy equipment, concrete dust everywhere. Victoria spent nearly 3 hours speaking with employees, learning names, asking questions, listening. When she finally started heading toward her car, one of the supervisors caught up with her. A man named Daniel. "Can I tell you something?" Victoria smiled. "Sure." Daniel shoved his hands into his pockets. "We were happy when you got involved." The comment surprised her. "Really?" He nodded. "Most executives come here for pictures." Victoria laughed. "That's probably fair." "I'm serious." Daniel pointed toward the workers. "They notice when someone actually cares." The words stayed with her during the drive home, because for years she had measured herself against what happened. The affair, the divorce, the betrayal. Now people were responding to who she was, not what she'd survived. And that felt different. Better. Months passed. The company continued growing. Victoria continued learning. The board continued trusting her with more responsibility. Then one morning, Harold Bennett called. "Got a minute?" "Always." Harold sounded amused. "We took a vote." Victoria frowned. "What kind of vote?" "The kind that's going to make your day more complicated." Her stomach immediately tightened. "Harold." He laughed. "Congratulations, CEO." For a moment, Victoria said nothing. The words seemed to hang in the air. CEO. The title felt strange, too large, too important, too far away from the woman who had once sat at her kitchen table, wondering how her life had fallen apart. Yet somehow, here she was, not because someone handed her success, because she earned trust. One decision at a time, one day at a time, one difficult step at a time. That evening she sat alone on her back porch. The sun was setting. The air was cool. For the first time in years, she allowed herself to look backward. Not at Lawrence, not at Rachel, at herself. The woman she used to be. The woman who thought losing a marriage meant losing her future. She smiled softly, because if someone had shown her this moment back then, she never would have believed it. Not the title, not the confidence, not the peace. The most surprising part wasn't how much her life had changed. It was how much she had changed. And somewhere across town, Rachel and Lawrence were beginning to discover something she already knew. The hardest consequences aren't financial, they're emotional, and theirs were just beginning. By the second year after the divorce, Victoria barely recognized her own life, not because everything was perfect, because everything was hers. The company was growing, new projects were moving forward, employees seemed genuinely invested in the future. And for the first time in a very long while, Victoria woke up excited about what came next. That feeling still surprised her. Some mornings she caught herself smiling for no reason, not because she had forgotten the past, because the past no longer controlled the present. One afternoon, Harold Bennett stopped by her office. He was carrying a folder and wearing the expression he usually reserved for good news. "Tell me you've got 5 minutes." Victoria laughed. "For you, always." Harold handed her the folder. Inside were plans for the company's largest expansion project in nearly a decade. Victoria scanned the documents, then looked up. "This is actually happening?" Harold smiled. "It is." Several months of work had finally paid off. The board approved the project unanimously. Investors were excited. Employees were excited. The entire company was celebrating. To mark the occasion, Glenview Development Holdings planned a large event. A formal evening celebration. Employees, investors, community leaders. Everyone would be there. Victoria almost declined the spotlight. Almost. Then she remembered something she had spent years learning. Confidence wasn't about being comfortable. It was about showing up anyway. So she agreed. The ballroom was packed. Music drifted softly through the room. Servers moved between tables carrying drinks and appetizers. Conversations filled every corner. Victoria spent most of the evening greeting guests, former clients, investors, employees, people she genuinely appreciated. It felt good, not because of the attention, because of the relationships. Because unlike so many things in her old life, these connections were built on honesty. About an hour into the event, Victoria was speaking with a project manager when she noticed someone approaching. It was the head of security. His expression immediately caught her attention. "Everything okay?" The man hesitated. Not a good sign. "We have a situation." Victoria frowned. "What kind of situation?" The security manager glanced toward the entrance. She followed his gaze and immediately saw them, Rachel and Lawrence. For a second, Victoria genuinely thought she must be mistaken. Neither had received invitations. Neither worked for the company. Neither belonged at the event. Yet there they were, standing just inside the ballroom, looking around. Several nearby guests had already noticed. Whispers were beginning. The security manager lowered his voice. "What would you like us to do?" Victoria looked across the room, then back at him. The answer came surprisingly easily. "Handle it." The manager nodded. No anger, no hesitation, just professionalism. Exactly what she wanted. Unfortunately, Rachel had other ideas. Security approached politely. Most people would have left. Rachel didn't. The conversation became tense almost immediately, then louder, then impossible to ignore. Heads turned. Conversation stopped. The entire room seemed to shift toward the entrance. Victoria remained where she was, watching from across the ballroom, not because she enjoyed it, because she couldn't stop it. Rachel crossed her arms. "I have every right to be here." The security manager remained calm. "No, ma'am, this is a private event." Lawrence looked uncomfortable, more uncomfortable than Victoria had ever seen him. He kept glancing around the room, realizing exactly how many people were watching. Rachel wasn't finished. Her voice rose again. People nearby stepped away, creating space, creating silence, the kind of silence that makes public embarrassment feel even worse. Finally, Lawrence touched her arm. "Rachel," the single word carried exhaustion, not authority, not confidence. Exhaustion. Rachel looked at him, then around the room, and for the first time, she seemed to understand what everyone else already knew. Nobody was on her side. Nobody was impressed. Nobody was intimidated. They were simply witnessing consequences. Security escorted them toward the exit. Slowly, publicly, the entire ballroom watched, not because people were cruel, because nobody could look away. Years earlier, Rachel had walked into Victoria's life believing she had won something. Tonight, that illusion finally disappeared. As the doors closed behind them, the room remained quiet for several seconds. Then conversation slowly resumed. People returned to their tables. Music continued. Life moved on. Victoria stood there for a moment, unexpectedly emotional, not triumphant, not vindicated, relieved, because watching Rachel and Lawrence leave felt like the closing of a chapter she had already finished reading. Harold eventually appeared beside her. "You okay?" Victoria smiled. "Yeah." He studied her for a second, then nodded. "Good." As the celebration continued around them, Victoria realized something. For years, she thought healing would feel dramatic, like a breakthrough, like a victory. Instead, it felt simple, like looking at people who once had the power to destroy you, and realizing they don't anymore. And somewhere outside that ballroom, Rachel and Lawrence were finally facing a truth neither of them had expected. The life they sacrificed everything to build wasn't making either of them happy. Rachel left 6 months later, not after a dramatic fight, not after some explosive argument that finally ended everything. The relationship simply ran out of excuses. One disappointment at a time, one resentment at a time, one reality at a time, until eventually there was nothing left holding it together. Victoria heard about it the same way she heard most things these days, through other people. Melissa called one afternoon. "Did you hear?" Victoria looked up from her desk. "Hear what?" A pause. Then, "Rachel moved out." Victoria leaned back in her chair. The information sat there for a moment, unexpectedly weightless. 2 years earlier, news like that would have consumed her thoughts. Now it barely registered. "Oh," Melissa laughed. "That's it? What do you want me to say?" "I don't know." Victoria smiled. "Neither do I." And that was the truth. There was no celebration, no satisfaction, no feeling of victory, because by then, Rachel's life had stopped being part of Victoria's story. The same was true of Lawrence. For the first time in years, he was alone. Actually alone. No affair, no marriage, no fantasy, just himself. And that's when certain realizations finally started arriving. The quiet kind, the kind nobody applauds, the kind that usually show up late at night when there's nobody left to blame. He began noticing things he'd never noticed before. The way Victoria used to remember birthdays, the way she handled family obligations, the way she solved problems before they became emergencies, the way she kept life moving without needing credit for it. Thousands of small things, invisible things, the kind people only recognize after they're gone. One evening, Lawrence found an old photo while cleaning out a storage box. It had been taken years earlier. A summer cookout. Victoria was laughing at something off camera. Rachel stood beside her. Everyone looked happy. For several seconds, Lawrence stared at the picture, then, quietly, put it away. Because some mistakes become impossible to fix. Not because forgiveness doesn't exist. Because time keeps moving. And eventually, people build lives that no longer have room for you. Almost 3 years after the divorce, Lawrence saw Victoria again, completely by accident. A community fundraiser downtown. The event was crowded. People filled the room. Conversations blended together. Lawrence was speaking with someone near the entrance when he saw her. At first, he wasn't entirely sure it was Victoria, not because she looked different, because she carried herself differently. The uncertainty was gone. The hesitation, the constant effort to make everyone else comfortable. She seemed lighter, more confident, like someone who had finally stopped apologizing for taking up space. Lawrence watched her laugh at something a friend said. The smile came easily, naturally, and for a brief moment, he felt something he hadn't expected. Not jealousy, regret, the clean kind, the honest kind, the kind that arrives when you finally understand what you lost. He considered walking over several times, but every version of the conversation ended the same way. Too late. So, he stayed where he was, and eventually she disappeared into the crowd. Months later came the moment neither of them knew would be their final connection to the past. Victoria had recently moved into a beautiful home just outside Glenview. Nothing extravagant, just peaceful. Trees, open space, quiet evenings, the kind of place she'd always wanted. One warm Saturday evening, friends gathered at the house. People who had stood beside her during the hardest years. People who stayed. Laughter drifted from the patio. Music played softly through open windows. Someone was telling a story that had everyone laughing so hard they could barely finish it. Victoria stepped away from the group for a moment, just long enough to stand near the railing overlooking the property. The sun was beginning to disappear behind the trees, the sky painted in shades of gold and orange. For a few seconds, she simply stood there, thinking, not about the affair, not about the divorce, not about Rachel or Lawrence, about the journey, about how terrified she'd been the day she walked away. How convinced she'd been that her life was ending, when in reality, something else had been happening. Her life was beginning again. A voice called her name from inside. One of her friends. Victoria smiled, then turned toward the house, toward the laughter, toward the people waiting for her, toward the future she'd built herself. Down the road, stopped briefly at an intersection, Lawrence happened to glance in the direction of the property, just for a moment, long enough to see the lights, the people, the life, long enough to see Victoria walking back inside, surrounded by people who genuinely loved her, happy, at peace, moving forward. He watched for a second, then drove on, because even he understood something now. Victoria hadn't won because he lost. She hadn't won because Rachel left. She hadn't won because the trust saved her. She won because she refused to let betrayal become the rest of her story. Inside the house, laughter grew louder. Someone handed Victoria a drink. Another friend pulled her into a conversation. Life continued. The evening continued. And for the first time in a very long time, the past finally felt exactly where it belonged. Behind her. Before you leave, I want your honest opinion. Do you think Victoria got lucky because of the trust? Or do you think she would have won in the end anyway because of the way she handled everything after the betrayal? Let me know in the comments. I can't wait to read your thoughts.
Thank you for watching Mr. Graham Stories, my beautiful, amazing family.